Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Achim Plum. I'm the CEO of InfanDx. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to tell our story here, and hopefully I'll get you a little excited about what we are doing. Let me start with a brief introduction of the company. Virginia Apgar, one of the leading neonatologists of her time, once coined the sentence, "Being born is the most dangerous moment in our life," referring to the fact that many things can go wrong when we suddenly have to adapt to an independent life outside the uterus. Our mission is to improve outcomes in neonatal, acute, and critical care conditions by innovative diagnostic solutions. With this mission in mind, the company was started in 2010 in Cologne, Germany, where it's still headquartered at the BioCampus. The organization is very lean, however, we can rely on some very strong partners in achieving our goals. That, for example, includes the University Hospital of Tübingen in the management of our clinical trials, or the Furtwangen University in our metabolomics and biostatistics research. Speaking of partners, we are advised by some of the most distinguished experts in neonatology, metabolomics, and biostatistics, some of which were actually co-founders of the company. And I just come back from a full-day scientific advisory board meeting with these people, and I can tell you it was very inspiring and very helpful for the further development of our lead product and our product pipeline. I'm in the fortunate position to work with a very agile management team with seasoned industry experts like Wolfgang Kinzel, the chairman of our supervisory board, or Gunther Weiss, who has tremendous experience in biomarker and IVD development both in Europe and the US, or Andreas Lischka, who has managed the finances of many biotechs before. And combine that with some really talented younger people like Carola, Sabine, and Mostafa. Now let's talk a bit about the medical need that we are trying to address with our lead product in development. The indication we're targeting is called Hypoxic-Ischemic Encephalopathy, or HIE. HIE is defined as brain damage as a result of oxygen deprivation around the time of birth. Now, that brain damage can become permanent, leading to lifelong disabilities, including cerebral palsy, cognitive disabilities, epilepsy, or hearing and vision impairments. Out of the 125 million newborns every year, it is estimated that 10 to 15% are at risk for perinatal asphyxia and, in consequence, HIE. Over 1 million babies annually are neurologically injured by these conditions, and over 700,000 babies die because the damage is fatal. Now, the good news is there is a therapy for HIE called therapeutic hypothermia. In this intervention, the core body temperature of the babies is lowered by 3 to 4 degrees centigrade for 72 hours. It's a quite severe intervention, however, it slows down the metabolic rate in the brain and thereby allows it to recover. It's currently the only guideline recommended therapy and reimbursed in many healthcare systems. However, it comes with a caveat. To be effective, it needs to be initiated within 6 hours of birth. This 6-hour time window provides a diagnostic dilemma. On one hand, you have baseline diagnostics available in that time frame, but those are not very indicative of the presence of HIE and the severity of HIE. On the other hand, there is instrument-based diagnostics that is much more precise, including AEGs or MR imaging. However, those come too late to support a treatment decision. It is this diagnostic dilemma we want to solve with our HypoxE test in development. The HypoxE test is designed as a blood test that can be performed on a very small blood sample taken right after birth to indicate brain damage reliably within that 6-hour time window required to initiate therapy. We focus on differences in metabolite concentrations in the blood, as we believe that this is the class of biomarker that reacts most dynamically to physiological changes. We believe that such a test can address the needs of all key stakeholders involved. Parents obviously want the best care for their babies, Neonatologists want to take objective and data-driven treatment decisions. Hospitals want to have a best practice reputation, but also avoid legal liability. Actually, in the US, malpractice or alleged malpractice around the birth process is one of the key reasons why hospitals are sued. Insurances are faced with the tremendous cost of lifelong disabilities that could potentially have been prevented by a timely therapy. And from a regulatory perspective, the US FDA considers HIE an orphan disease indication, highlighting the need for better management of these patients. The market potential of such a test is comparable to top-selling current diagnostic tests. We are talking about an intended use population of 15 to 20 million newborns, so children that are at risk of having HIE. Now, if we assume a test price of less than €100, this gives you a €2 billion market. Now, if we just look at segments that can initially be serviced of that market, we are still talking about an opportunity in the range of 500 million or more. Now let's talk a little bit about our product concept and where we are in developing such product. We are pursuing a product concept in which a routine blood draw taken at birth is analyzed on standard clinical chemistry analyzers in a fully automated way for certain changes in metabolites, the biomarkers. And the results of those tests are then interpreted and integrated with other clinical information in a cloud-based application, and a diagnostic report is sent back to the clinician. The whole test turnaround time should be less than 1 hour, with the actual test taking only 15 to 20 minutes. We target 2 settings, the STAT for short turnaround time labs or satellite labs, so small labs present in any hospital that are close to the delivery room, and on the other hand, point of care settings where the testing is actually performed in the delivery room or the neonatal intensive care unit. In the concept, the biomarkers are proprietary to us as well as the interpretive algorithm. However, when it comes to the actual instruments on which the tests are performed, we are relying on partners. And to that end, we have identified suitable IVD platforms and partners to work with. We have done requirement engineering, so we know exactly what we need to do to get our test technically onto those platforms, and feasibility studies are ongoing. Now let me talk a little bit on where we are with our biomarkers. We have identified candidate biomarkers in preliminary studies that show excellent performance in distinguishing between healthy controls and children that require hypothermal therapy due to HIE. As you can see here, the groups are split in almost perfect way. We see, for the experts among you, areas under the curve of greater than 0.95, sensitivity of 92%, and specificity of 91%. Now, we also know that combining several of those biomarkers can further increase performance. To further evaluate and eventually validate those biomarkers, we have access to 2 unique study cohorts, the AMBI cohort and the Bannon cohort. In both cohorts, we can classify the babies whether they have HIE or not based on one hand on instrument-based diagnostics taken within days of birth, but also based on a 2-year outcome that we collected. Now, this clinical HIE classification is then compared with metabolite profiles we generate on blood samples taken at birth of each study subject, and that gives us HIE biomarkers. These biomarkers then can be correlated with absence or presence of disease, severity of disease, or prognosis when we look at the 2-year outcome. The AMBI study is actually closed and all data curated. We have identified novel biomarkers but also confirmed our previous candidate biomarkers in that cohort, and the panel design is expected to be finalized as we speak, still in this quarter. Now, the Bannon study will be used for panel optimization validation and eventually also IVD test validation under IVDR. It's much larger, and here we expect to close a 2-year follow-up in Q1 next year, so it becomes available for panel validation in mid-2022. With regard to the specific products, we are working on 3 product generations. A first generation product that we will use for market education. It's a liquid chromatography and mass spectroscopy based method. So it's very close to the discovery technology we actually use to identify the biomarkers. And it can serve as a basis for so-called laboratory developed tests. So tests that are implemented by individual labs and then validated by those labs themselves, and can serve key opinion leaders and early adopters that want to start working with our biomarkers. We can do that as early as Q3 of next year. Now, the first broadly commercially available test will be based on a clinical chemistry analyzer that is broadly available in these smaller labs that are close to the patient, and here we expect a European market introduction by the end of 2023, and then in the after a suitable FDA trial, and I'll talk to that in a minute, by the end of 2026 at the latest in the US. Now, the third generation targets a further market segment, the point of care testing market. So here we will implement the test on a analyzer that is suitable for point of care use, so can be operated by the midwife or the nurse in the delivery room, or by a nurse on a neonatal intensive care unit. And here we expect a launch by the end of 2024 in Europe. I mentioned the US as a target market, so why is the US market important in InfanDx? Well, the epidemiology is similar to Europe. However, the FDA considers HAE an orphan disease indication, making certain regulatory approval pathways faster and easier. Hypothermia, as in Europe, is the only guideline-recommended therapy for HAE, and there's very strong advocacy and patient awareness around the topic of HAE in the US. Now, on the market side, well, it is the largest homogeneous healthcare market. It is less price sensitive and more innovation friendly than most European markets. But last not least, litigation due to medical malpractice or alleged medical malpractice during childbirth is a major issue and could become a further driver, apart from the medical need, of the adoption of our test. To accelerate the entry in the US market, we are pursuing a strategy where we first want to launch a test with a purely diagnostic claim that we basically benchmark against the instrument-based diagnostics. And then later on, after we have follow-up data on the patient, file for a second approval with a prognostic claim. And that way we expect to shorten time to market significantly in the US. However, we have to discuss that strategy with the FDA, and we are preparing an FDA pre-submission meeting, hopefully in the first quarter of next year. There's some uncertainty to that due to the whole COVID situation. We want to set up then clinical operations in the US to prepare for a clinical trial that we want to initiate in the last quarter of next year. With our R&D roadmap, we expect to reach numerous milestones over the next 12 months that are key value drivers and will significantly further de-risk the entire story. So if we look at the biomarker track, we expect to still define the final biomarker panel in this quarter. We then will finish the follow-up of the Bannon cohort by the end of the first quarter of next year, and that puts us in a position to validate the biomarker panel to the highest level of evidence by mid-year next year. So on the product side, we expect to show feasibility of that first generation liquid chromatography mass spectroscopy method by early next year, and then release a method that can be used as a basis for lab-developed tests in Q3 of next year. And on the clinical chemistry assay side, we expect to show feasibility of a generation 2 lab-based method in Q2 next year, and eventually for a point-of-care based method towards the end of the year. And when it comes to getting market access in the US, well, we are in the process of incorporating US subsidiary as a basis for our US operations as we speak. We hope to have FDA pre-submission meeting by late Q1 next year. However, the caveat here is that we don't know when FDA is back to normal operations due to COVID-19. But based on FDA feedback, we will then design the US clinical trial and expect to initiate that in late 2022. Now let's have a quick look at the business plan, what we actually want to achieve commercially with those products. If we look at the big picture, we aim at seeding the market with our own product. So products where we are the legal manufacturer, and we want to do so in Europe and certain rest of world markets. We can start there in 2022 with the laboratory developed test, but broadly commercially towards the end of 2023 with the lab-based IVD method as explained. Now, and we want to do so in the US market with a market entry based on the lab developed test and with some more lead time in 2023 and eventually an FDA approved IVD test in 2026. Perhaps a bit earlier depending on the trial design we can agree upon with the FDA. Now, when I say seeding, I expect that we eventually, after demonstrating a commercial proof of concept, start licensing our biomarkers as well as the interpretive algorithm to larger players that then can achieve further market penetration and also allow us to expand into further geographies that we cannot address ourselves. For example, China. For cost-effective selling of our own products, we aim at establishing what I call a hybrid sales channel in Europe and the US. So in this approach, we work with distributors that focus on lead generation and technical sales execution. But being fully aware that distributors are rarely in a position to do a clinical pitch, so explain the clinical utility of a novel product, we aim at supporting those distributors with a strong medical science liaison team that helps to do the medical education and go with the distributor to the key accounts and help them making the case to the clinicians. If we now model the targeted product launches and the associated revenue streams, be it the reagent sales, instrument sales, software as a service, so the data interpretation and licensing, we would be in a position to achieve a certain commercial proof of concept probably in 2025, an EBIT break even at around 20 million revenue in 2026, and in 2030 revenues on around 90 million. Now, that translates into product revenues of 150 million if we take the sales by our distribution partners and licensees at a total available market of 535 million. Serviceable market at 535 million. So leaving quite an upside for our licensees to further penetrate that market. So let me summarize the InfanDx equity story. We are a diagnostics company with the mission to improve outcomes in neonatal acute and critical care by novel diagnostic solutions. The lead product development is the HypoxE Test for early diagnosis of HIE. It's an attractive market opportunity with 10 to 15% of all newborns being at risk, and at a test price of around €100. That translates into a 2 billion total market and an initial serviceable market of north of 500 million. We have a very progressive business model. We combine established IVD reagent business with software as a service for data interpretation and clinical decision support, and a very cost-effective hybrid sales channel for our own products for market seeding, followed by licensing to larger players for harvesting the market through further penetration. We have a low-risk product strategy by leveraging widely used diagnostics platforms by partners for rapid commercial deployment. We have identified HIV biomarkers and we are in the process of defining the final panel, and we will validate that panel by mid of next year. We expect near-term market introductions, initially by means of a lab-developed test in Europe starting from Q3 of next year, followed by the first CE IVD product in late 2023. We have a strong further strategic focus on the US, and we expect to initiate a US clinical trial for FDA submission in later 2022 and establish first installations of lab-developed tests for early adopters and key opinion leaders starting from early 2023. We have a very defined commercial strategy that puts us on a trajectory for commercial proof of concept by 2025 and EBIT break-even by 2026. Now, if you like our equity story or even got excited, we can offer you to become part of that story in a Series B funding round that we plan for Q3 of next year on the back of those value-driving milestones I just presented. Thanks a lot for your attention.